Hello. This is going to be a review of photosynthesis for CP and honors. Okay, first the formula. So this formula can be expressed in different ways, and each way kind of helps a different kind of learner. First, you have the formula in pictures. So for photosynthesis, you're going to start off these three dots right here that represents a carbon dioxide molecule. Okay, carbon and oxygen together in carbon dioxide. Then you have a water droplet, which represents water, and a sun, which represents light. This is what gives energy to photosynthesis for it to happen. And that is going to give us sugar, and it's going to give us oxygen. So the sugar that we eat, and the sugar, the form that sugar will be in after photosynthesis, that will be glucose. And then photosynthesis gives us all the oxygen that we breathe. So autotrophs, plants that can go through photosynthesis, are going to give us all the, basically it uses the sunlight to give us all the food that we eat. And it's going to give us the oxygen that we breathe. So without photosynthesis, we wouldn't be alive. So then photosynthesis, the formula in words, it can be carbon dioxide and water combined with sunlight to create oxygen and glucose. And finally, CO2 plus H2O plus sunlight gives us C6H12O6, which is that large thing right there. Lots of students kind of get freaked out and scared when they see that. But actually, that's just glucose, lots of carbon and oxygen. And then finally, the oxygen that we breathe. Okay, so everyone likes the formula in a different particular way, and that's good. And I just like to see all three of them right here. Okay, all right. So with photosynthesis, we're going to start with our products, which are right here, and then get to our reactants, okay? And all of this happens in the leaves of plants, which have large surface areas which spread out to collect all that sunlight, because sunlight provides the energy. So let's talk about sunlight a little bit. So sunlight is made of white light, and it's going to white light is actually made up of all the colors, okay, Roy G. Biv. And what's going to happen is leaves, particularly the chlorophyll in the cells that make up leaves, have certain pigments. And pigments, just like if you have like a little mole somewhere on your body, that mole is going to be, that skin is going to be darker than the skin around it, and that's because it has certain pigments that absorb light. So pigments that are in leaves are called chlorophyll. You have chlorophyll A and B, and they're going to be in leaves. And what's going to happen is, actually, it's chlorophylls absorb lots of red and orange light and lots of blue and violet light. And so that's what it uses for energy during photosynthesis. However, leaves are green because they reflect green light. And many students might think it's actually the opposite, that they absorb green light, so that's why they're green. But actually, no, it's that they reflect green light, and that's the only reason you can see it. You can only see light that is reflected, okay? So only the green light will be reflected, and actually plants will not grow well in green light. They will grow much better in red, blue, or purple light. Okay, so photosynthesis can be broken down into two different reactions. Okay, so you have the light dependent reaction, and you have the light independent reaction. Okay, and so the light dependent reaction, it requires sunlight. So you have the sun shining down on Earth and all the planets, Earth and all the plants, and you have these light waves that are eventually going to hit these things here called thylakoids. Now, before we get too deep into this, we need to remember that this whole thing, this is a chloroplast, okay? It's funny how sometimes students are following me through this whole process and understanding everything that's going on, and then they forget that what organelle all this is happening in. This is a chloroplast. And I'm using my mouse now to write this. Hopefully this is more clear than my past videos. Chloroplast. Okay, so this whole thing is the chloroplast. And so half, you have both of these reactions happening. Now, this right here is called the thylakoid. And each of these, you have a thylakoid here, you have a thylakoid here, and one here. It's these like little pancake-like things. The whole stack together, that's called a grana, G-R-A-N-A. Okay, so you have these thylakoids, and on the membrane are certain proteins that help with photosynthesis. But so what's going to happen is water and sunlight are needed for the light-dependent reaction, water and sunlight. And then water is actually, it's going to leave the hydrogens behind, and it's actually going to leave a few electrons behind as well. And so then water is going to become oxygen, or oxygen is going to leave. Water is the reactant. The product, what's produced, is going to be oxygen. Okay, now you have the Kelvin cycle, or the light-independent reaction. Kelvin cycle. Okay, now this is the part that uses CO2. So this was in the equation before too. So this is the part where CO2 is used. And so CO2 is used, and sugars are created at the end. Sugars or glucose. Okay, and this happens, so before this happened in the thylakoid, this happens in the stroma, which is all this area. Actually, the stroma is over here too. It's all the area outside the thylakoids. And so the Kelvin cycle is a series of chemical reactions that eventually give rise to glucose. And that's the whole glucose. Star that, circle it, highlight it. That is the main point of photosynthesis, for the plant to be able to store the sunlight as chemical energy, store that energy. Okay, sorry, not store sunlight, store the energy from sunlight as chemical energy, and that's going to be in glucose. Okay, now notice you have a few things being recycled here. NADPH and ATP are going over here toward the Kelvin cycle. Then you have ADP and NADP plus going this way towards the light-dependent reaction. So these are reused. ATP is a molecule that carries energy, and so it's gaining that energy from the sunlight in the light-dependent reaction, and then it's going over here to the Kelvin cycle and releasing that energy to then be stored in glucose. The NADPH, that's the electron carrier. It's going to gain 2 electrons and drop those high energy electrons over here. After it drops off those electrons, it will be NADP plus, and then that will go back over here. So these molecules are going to be recycled. They're just dropping things off, like either NADPH, it's dropping off little electrons, or ATP, it's dropping off energy. Okay, and those high energy electrons and the raw energy from ATP are needed for this cycle to happen. Okay. All right. So for review, if you would like to fill this out, I think it would be very beneficial. Many students have already done it, but it would help, can only help you if you do it again. So here you can draw a T-chart, and then you can compare the first and the second step of photosynthesis. So the first step will be the light dependent. Okay, I'm not going to write the whole thing out. So the light dependent, and the second one will be the Kelvin cycle. Okay, and draw a little period there. Okay, so the location, you can say, for instance, stroma. Okay. Fill this out. What is one thing that it starts with? Over here, CO2, over here, H2O, and sunlight. Okay? And yeah, so if you would like to review, you could pause that actually earlier in the video before I started writing on here. Or right now while it's blank, and then compare that with this key, okay? And I'll move myself over here so you can better see. And both of them happen in the chloroplast. Okay, now CP students, that's all I have for you. If you're honors, please keep watching. Okay. All right, so now here we have, we're going to talk about the photosystems 1 and 2. So here we have photosystem 2. Remember, photosystem 2 comes first, and then we have photosystem 1. So this is the light-dependent reaction because, well, we have light, and that's shining into the chloroplast onto the thylakoid membrane. And you have these proteins. So these proteins have pigments in them that are going to absorb the sunlight, and that energy is going to be used, or water is going to split, and that energy is going to be used from sunlight. It's going to be absorbed by the electron, and it's going to then go through this electron transport chain. And it's a similar process as the one involved in cellular respiration. And so that it's going to gain energy from sunlight. The electron is going to be passed through the electron transport chain. And while it's doing that, oh, the light's just turned off. Turn back on. Okay. And then as it's doing that, a hydrogen will be pumped into the thylakoid space. Okay, so photosystem 1 is when the electron first gets energized, and that's when water splits into oxygen, and the hydrogens are now in the lumen, or the thylakoid space. Then photosystem 1 re-energizes that electron, and then it is going to be accepted by NADPH. Okay. Now, as these hydrogens, they start to build up because of, not only because of the water that's being split to form hydrogen and oxygen, but because of the electron transport chain that's pumping them actively into the thylakoid space. Now, all these hydrogen ions are building up in number and in charge, so the thylakoid space is becoming very positively charged. And so these molecules really want to spread out. They want to leave the thylakoid space, and they do that through ATP synthase. And the ATP synthase, it rotates and it captures that energy to turn ADP into ATP. Okay, so we have our products here. We have oxygen, we have ATP, and we have NADPH. Next, we have the Calvin cycle. That's going to happen over here in the stroma. Okay, so what you have here is you have CO2 is entering, and CO2 is going to then add a carbon to each one of these 5-carbon molecules to form 6 3-carbon molecules. The important steps here are that ATP and NADPH are going to energize these 3-carbon molecules. It's going to become G3P. Okay, and then so you have 12 total. 2 of them get to leave to form glucose and other sugar substances, and then the rest of them will be recycled. Okay. And a little bit more ATP is needed for them to turn into these 5 carbons, which will eventually pick up more carbon from the carbon dioxide. Okay. All right. That's all I have for you. I hope this helped.